At one point in time, there was no such thing as mulligans, and you had to play whatever hand you drew. Greetings, owners of fine luxury cardboard rectangles, and welcome to my evolution of mulliganing. Mulligans, mulligatawny. It's a weird word, mulligan. I think of Gilligan from Gilligan's Island, but that's not what this is about. This is not a history of Gilligan. Let us speak of mulligans. Now, as I previously mentioned right at the very beginning of the video, there was a time when mulligans were not actually part of the game. Originally, the playtesters, or at least a portion of them, had decided that allowing mulligans rewarded sloppy and poor deck construction skills. So basically the idea was, if you don't want to have problems with your hand, then make sure you have a good deck. Now, that's not really the greatest approach, in all honesty. I understand. That is one thing I find about some games, is there's this whole hardcore aspect, and that's what Magic was like at the beginning. But that didn't last for very long. Mulligans were brought in by the DCI. Now, the DCI, these are the guys who provide DCI numbers. They're in charge of sanctioned play. So they started with the first mulligan rule, which was in '94. All right? And the first mulligan rule was a pretty straightforward one, and it's not anything that you're currently used to. You could only mulligan under two circumstances. Those circumstances were either you had a hand that was all land, or you had a hand with no lands. So if you had one land in your hand, you had to keep it. You know how when you're mulliganing, it's generally for reasons like, oh, I only have a one land hand. Or, you know, I have a bad matchup and I need a particular card. But either way, normally it's, oh God, I can't play this one land hand. Well, you were locked into that hand back in the day. That's how that worked. You had no choice. The good thing is when you did mulligan, you got to get a brand new full mitt of 7 cards, okay? So there is that. It was kind of like, you know, the current mulligan rules, you do lose cards with the mulligan. So it had its upside and it's had its downside. The other thing was, another weird little quirk was, if your opponent mulliganed, you could mulligan if you wanted. So if your opponent had all lands or no lands, regardless of what your hand was, you too had the option to mulligan. So that's kind of funky. And that's how it started out. And it lasted that way for 3 years until 1997, where the Paris mulligan technique was introduced. And it's kind of funny. The naming convention for these mulligan techniques is based off of the Pro Tour, where the city that the Pro Tour where this was tested, basically the first time they tested this rule set out, it's supposed to be named after the city, which is funny because the Paris event wasn't really supposed to be using these rules, and it was included in accidentally, and yet it is associated as Paris mulligan for some weird reason. But that naming convention will continue, and actually we'll have one from a different place coming up later on down the line. But first, let's talk about what a Paris mulligan is for those of you who don't know. Your traditional mulligan is, as I said, either if you had one land or no lands, you get a brand new hand of 7 cards. Paris mulligan works like this. If you don't like your hand, no problem. You can throw it back into your deck, shuffle it up, and draw a brand new hand, but minus 1 card. So if you had 7 cards and you mulliganed, then you would mulligan down to 6 cards. And you could keep continuing with that process. So if you wanted to, you could go 6, oh, I don't like these 6 cards, throw them back and get 5, and then go down to 4, down to 3, and so on. You have that option. You can mulligan all the way down to 0 technically, at which point you're required to accept that 0, and you can't keep insisting on mulligans to shuffle your deck. So that's how the Paris mulligan rule works. And the Paris mulligan rule actually was the mulligan rule for the majority of Magic. It didn't change again until Battle for Zendikar era, which was back in September of 2015. And that's when we changed to the Vancouver mulligan rule, which is a variation of the Paris mulligan. They're very similar. It uses the same concept. You can throw your hand back if you don't like it, shuffle it back into your deck, and draw a new hand less 1 card. But the Vancouver mulligan rule also stipulates that if after doing a mulligan you have fewer cards than your normal starting hand size, you get to scry for once. You get to look at the top card of your deck and decide if it stays on the top or goes to the bottom. So basically, it's the Paris Mulligan rule with the addition of, now when you're done mulliganing, if you don't have a full hand still, which in most cases you won't, then you do get to scry for one. So it's cool that way. Even if you are kind of land screwed, you get the ability to see what's coming from your next card and either say, yes, I want it, or no, I don't. So I do like the change that they've made this way. Now, I'm sure you're wondering, well, you just told me you put cards back in and you take one less each time. So when would there be a scenario where I wouldn't get to scry? Well, there's a free variant of Mulligan where it's the same concept as the Paris Mulligan. The first time you do it, though, you get a full mitt of 7 cards. So when playing multiplayer, that is the rule, actually. In multiplayer Magic, you play with the free Mulligan, where the first Mulligan for each player does not cost them a card from their hand. So they would still have 7 cards if they did Mulligan once, and in that case, because the way the Vancouver Mulligan rules are worded, they would not get the opportunity to then look at the top card. And if you're playing for some reason, if you're old school like me and you have the really, really old Arena Vanguard cards, they will actually change the amount of cards in your starting hand. Like if you're using Squee, you can actually start with a 10 card hand. It's either 9 or 10 card hand. So in that case, you would only get to scry if you had fewer than your starting hand size. If your starting hand size had been set to 10 by Squee, then you would actually only get to scry if you had 9 or less. And for Commander, they used to use a Paris variant Mulligan that was a little bit weird. They have moved on to adopting the Vancouver Mulligan rule officially, but the committee recommends that Commander players allow for one free Mulligan. So that's traditionally now the accepted way to do it with Commander. So that has been the evolution of the Mulligan from non-existent to only helping under the worst of circumstances to being a little bit more tactical, and now having a nice little extra smoothing out your problems at the end. You don't have enough lands, move that non-land to the bottom. You don't have enough lands, leave that land on the top kind of scenario. So that is pretty much wraps up everything to do with Mulligans in that regard. Thanks for coming by and hearing what I had to say. I like going through the history of all these different aspects of Magic, so I intend to continue to do so. If you enjoyed the video, let me know by hitting that like button. And make sure to check that you're subscribed, even if you were before, because YouTube has this really annoying glitch where it's unsubscribing people. So either resubscribe or go ahead and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.
Hi everyone. Together, we are the 6th color of magic.
We the best magic!